Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So today we're going to go into details and explain ineffective triggering and what are the clinical situations that we may encounter during mechanical ventilation that will lead to ineffective triggering. And first I want to explain what triggered the ventilator. So if we have this cartoon here, this is the airway pressure, and this is the alveolar pressure, and this is the intrathoracic pressure. This is at the end of expiration. We're assuming that we have zero airway pressure, zero alveolar pressure, and pleural pressure. Now, in order for this patient to breathe, and let's just say that it's spontaneous breathing, all what he needs to do is he needs to create a gradient between the airways and the alveoli. So with this gradient, the air will flow in from higher pressure to a lower pressure. So this will happen no matter what. If the patient drops the alveolar pressure below the airway pressure, it will be gradient and there will be flow. The magnitude of this flow will depend on how high is that gradient. If the patient is creating a gradient of -1, -2, it will be small flow. If the patient is able to create a gradient of -10, -15, it will be, of course, larger flow or higher flow. Now, spontaneous breath will happen no matter what. However, whether the ventilator is triggered or not, it depends on what level you set on the ventilator to be triggered. If the ventilator is not triggered, you get spontaneous breath. Now, if you set the trigger on the ventilator, if you turn it on and you set a trigger at, let's say, -5 centimeters of water, then the patient needs to drop the alveolar pressure to -5. That will be dropping the airway pressure, and then the ventilator will be triggered. And once the ventilator is triggered, the machine will give whatever you set on the ventilator. If you set pressure support ventilation, pressure support of, let's say, 10 centimeter or 12 centimeter will be delivered. So it will give the positive pressure. Now, I want to explain at the same time before we get into some examples. So what if the patient has auto-PEEP? You can see now I have alveolar pressure of 10 centimeters of water. This is just for simplicity. I made the pleural pressure at 0. In order to trigger the ventilator, we need to drop that pressure to -5. And in order to drop the alveolar pressure to -5, you need to go down from 10 to -5. That would require a work by the patient with a decreasing intrathoracic pressure or pleural pressure to -15. At that time, you can generate a pressure of -5 and trigger the ventilator. This is interactive session. If you have any question, please stop me and I'll be more than happy to explain further. So you need to differentiate between the spontaneous breath that will happen no matter what if the patient drops the pressure. However, the patient does not trigger the ventilator till he reaches the trigger threshold. If you set it at -5 centimeters of water, the patient needs to drop to -5 before he triggers the ventilator. With this, we will have different conditions that may cause ineffective triggering. We're going to reveal an example of effective trigger here, then weak efforts, then high trigger threshold, and auto-PEEP. And we're looking at the pressure curve. You can see the blue dotted line is the trigger threshold. This is what triggers the ventilator. And in the first example here, the patient needs to drop the pressure from 0 to -5 centimeters of water in order to trigger the ventilator. So if the patient started to breathe, what you see in the light orange color here is the esophageal pressure. And the red solid color is the airway pressure. So you can see that the patient drops the intrathoracic pressure and he goes below the trigger level. As he's dropping the intrathoracic pressure, the airway pressure goes down. And once we reach that threshold level for triggering, the ventilator is triggered with positive pressure. And you can see the pressure goes up to 15 centimeters of water. That means that we're setting, this is pressure control or pressure support. We're setting the control or the support at level of 15 centimeters. You can see that the patient continues to breathe with inhalation, of course, at the same time as the machine is giving the breath. And it happened that the end of breath is coinciding with the inspiratory time that you set on the machine. The start of inspiration is where the patient started to drop the intrathoracic or the pleural pressure. And the trigger point is the point where the patient drops the pressure inside the chest to the level that the airway pressure reaches that threshold level. This is the trigger point. And of course, the alveolar pressure, I have a mistake in the graph here. I want to correct it. And yeah, so the pleural pressure, the alveolar pressure is less than the airway pressure. You're looking at the alveolar pressure, you need to remove the pressure required to overcome the resistance. And once the ventilator finishes the breath, the airway pressure drops suddenly. However, the alveolar pressure will drop gradually till we empty the lungs completely. So in this case here, we're saying that this is effective trigger, meaning that the patient was able to drop the airway pressure to the trigger threshold and the ventilator is triggered. So the first case would be the right top graph here, where we're setting the trigger level at -5 centimeters of water, similar to the first case here. And the patient initiates the breath. You can see the patient is inhaling. This is the esophageal pressure. It goes down. And with that, the alveolar pressure goes down too. However, it does not reach the trigger threshold. Therefore, the machine is not triggered, and that's why I did not give you any airway pressure. And you can see the alveolar pressure will go along with the esophageal pressure or the intrathoracic pressure. The patient completes the breath, and that would be spontaneous breath. Negative pressure, machine is not triggered. If we see the flow, it would be sine wave. We'll see now examples for this. And the breath is ended by the patient. Similarly, if you set the trigger level at very high level, usually the trigger should be around -3 centimeters. We call it sensitivity also. So if you set it at -1 centimeter of water, that trigger will be very sensitive, meaning that any drop in the pressure will trigger the ventilator. If you set it at -10 centimeter, the patient needs to exert a lot of work in order to trigger the ventilator. So you need to adjust it. Of course, the trigger can be set based on the pressure or based on the flow. I'm just giving an example here based on the pressure. So here we have a trigger set at -8 centimeter of water, meaning that the patient needs to drop the pressure to -8 in order to trigger the ventilator. So this is good breath. Actually, you can see it's very similar to the first one. Even the pressure is dropped lower than -5. And it's dropping the alveolar pressure at the same time. However, it's not triggering the ventilator. Why? Because the trigger threshold is set very low, very high, I'm sorry. And the sensitivity is very, very low. If you set the pressure at very high level, meaning that more minus, at that time the sensitivity will be less. The machine will not respond unless the pressure gets to the level that you set it on the ventilator. Now the last case is when you have auto-PEEP. So let's say that you have airway pressure, let's say that you have alveolar pressure at 10 centimeter of water, meaning that we have auto-PEEP. This is expiration here, and you can see the alveolar pressure is at 10 centimeter of water. That is auto-PEEP. Now we did not change the trigger level here. It's still at -5 centimeter of water. And in order for the patient to trigger the ventilator, well, we need to drop that pressure to -5, meaning that the patient will need to exert so much effort in order to trigger the ventilator. He needs to overcome the auto-PEEP first, and then he needs to drop the pressure to -5 below the auto-PEEP in order to trigger the ventilator. And usually when you have auto-PEEP, some of this will be transmitted. So this is more representative now to the auto-PEEP. So much work that the patient has to do in order to pull down the pressure below the auto-PEEP. I will talk about that again in the examples. So let's see some examples here. The first one is, you can see the negative airway pressure, another negative, and the third negative. You can see the trigger level with the orange color. The patient the airway pressure has to reach this trigger level in order to trigger the ventilator. And as you see in the first 3 breaths, the patient did not reach that pressure trigger level or threshold. In the 4th one, he was able to reach it, and the ventilator was triggered. You can see pressure wave here, decelerating flow wave. Now, if you go back to this is, we say, ineffective or not triggered breath. it doesn't mean that there is no breath. It is spontaneous breath. You can see the patient drops the pressure. There's sine wave of the flow. This is inspiration. You can see some flow, some volume. It's a very small volume, but the patient inhaled some. As long as the patient is able to generate a gradient between the airway pressure and the alveolar pressure, there will be flow. And that's what you see here. The first breath, the second breath, and even the third one is associated with larger flow, and you can see better tidal volume. The fourth one, where the machine is triggered and the patient got better tidal volume. So what we say here is that the patient was weak, did not reach the threshold level, or the threshold level is set too high for the patient. So let's take a look on this. What you see on the left side is you can see negative deflections on the pressure over time curve. You can see the first one is triggering the ventilator, second one is not triggering the ventilator. You can see coincided with the inspiratory flow. The third one triggered the ventilator. Then the fourth one, 1, 2, 3, 4 other breaths, all negative pressures, but positive flow without triggering the ventilator. Now, if you take a look on the esophageal pressure, you can see each one of this associated with a drop in the esophageal pressure, indicating that the patient is trying to breathe. However, the patient was not able to reach the threshold level to trigger the ventilator. Now, when you take a look on the trigger threshold, well, you can see that it is actually flow, and it's set at 5 liters per minute, relatively high. Usually 3 liters per minute would be enough to set the trigger level at. And now you need to notice when we change the trigger to 2 liters, well, we were able to trigger the ventilator with every single breath of the patient. However, yes, you are responding to every single breath for the patient, but look what you did. The patient's neural drive is very high. He's breathing very fast, actually. And now when you responded to every single breath the patient is doing, well, now the ventilator is triggered every single time when he drops the pressure. Well, he's breathing at very fast rate, and look at the flow. In the expiratory flow, you're not giving the patient enough time to exhale all the way, and you generated a dynamic hyperinflation syndrome for the patient. So yes, you can change the trigger level where you can respond to all the breaths of the patient, but you need to see what happens when you respond to this. But this patient needed to be probably sedated in a better way, so you can actually allow enough time for exhalation. This is another example where you can see the patient is on pressure support mode of ventilation. And the pressure support is 10 centimeters of water. However, the patient in this breath, you can see the ventilator is triggered, and here we have 10 centimeters of water above the PEEP level. Total pressure is 15 centimeters of water. The flow is decelerating flow wave, which is typical for any pressure wave. So this is pressure supported breath. With the second breath here, you can see that the flow is not decelerating. The flow is kind of sine wave. It's very small wave that you barely see. But you can see that it's associated with a drop in the pressure. However, this machine is always flow triggered. This is Drager machine. And you can see that the patient was not able to generate enough flow to trigger the ventilator. he generated some flow, he had inspiratory effort, and generated some volume. The volume is probably around 100, 150 maximum. So this is inspiration, this is expiration, all done by the patient. The patient did not reach the flow that is required to trigger the ventilator. In the next breath here, you can see the initial rise in the flow here. That was enough to trigger the ventilator, and the patient delivered, or the machine delivered, 10 centimeters of water above the PEEP level. So here it's either the patient is weak or the trigger threshold is set too high for the efforts of the patient. So let's take a look on this example here. What you see is first breath here, negative deflection. You can see pressure is triggered, machine is triggered. Flow is decelerating flow waveform. This coincided with negative exclusion in the esophageal pressure. Another breath also triggered the ventilator. This one triggered the ventilator, and this one too. In between, you can notice that if you take a look on the esophageal pressure, well, we have negative deflection here, meaning that we have inspiratory effort. And if you take a look, since this is inspiratory effort, the patient would try to suck air, and that would be represented with an increase in the flow. Without this, the flow would continue to go up gradually, but because of the inspiration here, the patient tried to take a breath. You can see the drop in the pressure on the pressure over time curve. This inspiratory effort was not enough to trigger the ventilator. It was weak, or the threshold is set too high. Similarly, you can see that not only in expiration, you have here in this, at this point here, you have inspiratory effort indicated by the negative deflection on the esophageal waveform. And you can see that the patient is trying to take a breath. In inspiration, the flow is higher. So it was going down. Without this, it would have continued to go down and cycle into expiration. However, here the patient has inspiratory effort. Of course, he did not trigger the ventilator. Not only this, you can see another ineffective breath by the patient. This is expiratory phase. You can see the negative inspiratory pressure in esophageal pressure curve, and the increase in the flow during expiration, indicating that the patient is trying to breathe. However, the effort was very shallow, that it did not drop the airway pressure significantly enough to trigger the ventilator. Same thing, another one here in inspiration, and here ineffective in expiration. Looks like we may have some questions. Okay, so all technical questions. All right. Okay, so if we take a look on this one, what do we see? Well, yes, there's an effort here. There's another one here, and there's another one here. Well, this one was fine. If you notice that you have variable flow, this flow is higher than this flow, and this flow is higher. When you have high flow or large tidal volume, at that time, of course, the high flow is going to lead to large tidal volume. So this is a flow indicating that the patient is going to get large tidal volume. If you have large tidal volume, you need a longer expiratory time to exhale. So you may have one breath that is associated with large tidal volume, and then if the neural drive is still at the same rate, the second one will come before complete exhalation, and that's what happened here. You can see that this is the expiratory time that is needed to exhale all the way. However, the respiratory drive of the patient is faster than this, so he got another breath here, and this breath was not able to trigger the ventilator. So this is an example of dynamic hyperinflation, but it is breath to breath. It's not necessarily because of bronchospasm or asthma. It could be just because not enough time for the expiration. You did not give enough time that you're able to exhale all the way. Of course, we call it dynamic when it is one on top of the other. Otherwise, it is just auto-PEEP. And this is another example where you can see that this patient not only has those negative deflections in the pressure, and you can see the positive or the increase in the flow here, indicating that the patient is trying to breathe here, and those were ineffective in generating or triggering the ventilator. Another one at this point, you can see the flow clearer here. This is the negative deflection in the pressure, and this is the increase in the flow. What you see also, you see that the pressure continues to go up higher. And why this is happening? Because we are building dynamic hyperinflation here. Of course, the pressure that is required will be required to overcome also whatever auto-PEEP is present. And auto-PEEP, you cannot measure it unless you put expiratory hold. But indirectly, you would know about auto-PEEP if you can see it happening. Here, it's happening in front of your eyes, one breath after the other. That's why you see the pressure is increasing gradually. So that means we got air in, not completely out, pressure raised. So the next breath, you need to overcome that auto-PEEP. So it goes up higher. More air in, not out. Or another breath is in, not completely out. You add this to the first air trapped, and then higher pressure, and then higher pressure, then higher pressure. And then you have effort here. The auto-PEEP was high enough that the patient was not able to overcome it. You need much lower intrathoracic pressure drop in order to trigger the ventilator. Now, of course, if you have auto-PEEP, we've talked about that when we talked about severe airflow obstruction, you would need to correct the problem by eliminating the auto-PEEP completely. And what you do on the ventilator is you need to extend the expiratory time. And you extend the expiratory time by allowing the patient to breathe in faster. You deliver the inspiration faster at higher flow and allow for more time for expiration. Try to utilize all the inspiratory time towards the inspiratory flow time. You don't want to keep any plateau. Maximize the inspiratory flow time and leave everything for expiration. So if you're able to extend the expiration to the level that you get rid of the auto-PEEP, that would be great. However, what if you started compromising the ventilation and you cannot extend the expiratory time more? Is there a way you can help the patient? Well, if the patient is on positive pressure ventilation and you're able to, the trigger is set at times, meaning that every 5 seconds there's a trigger, it really doesn't matter. You don't need to overcome that PEEP because you're setting the trigger not based on the the pressure patient is not triggering the ventilator anymore. The machine is triggered based on the time. However, once you change the trigger to respond to patient's effort, and we're going to assume that we have alveolar pressure of 10 centimeters of water. This is end of expiration. Airway pressure is 0, and alveolar pressure is 10 centimeters of water. In order for this patient to breathe below the airway pressure, in order for him to generate any flow, you need to drop that alveolar pressure from 10 centimeters of water down to -3 centimeters of water. And let's say we're setting the trigger at -3. That means that the patient needs to drop from 10 to -3. That is 13 centimeters of water. Much higher than if we don't have PEEP. Here, if we don't have PEEP, you can see that the patient, all what he needs to do is drop the pressure from 0 to -3. We have -5 here, but if we setting it at -3 to trigger the ventilator, where the patient is able to generate a flow from 0 to -3, there's a gradient. Flow will result as a result of the gradient, and you're going to be able to trigger the ventilator. If the patient is spontaneously breathing, in order to create a flow here, all what you need is -3, -5 centimeters of water. However, if you have auto-PEEP and patient spontaneously breathing, meaning the machine is not going to do anything for him, it's not going to be triggered. In order to get a flow, you need at least -2, -3 centimeters of water. That means it's going to drop the pressure to -13. That's a lot of inspiratory effort. So let's take the right part here and put it on the left here and see how we can help this patient. Again, as I said, this patient who's got auto-PEEP of 10 centimeters of water, in order to generate any flow, we need to drop below 0. So with this patient having auto-PEEP of 10, you need to drop to -3. The patient needs to generate -13 centimeters of water. If the ventilator is set at a trigger of -3, you will be able to trigger the ventilator. If the patient is spontaneously breathing, you're going to be able to just get the flow that is correlating with this drop in the pressure. Now, how can we help this patient? In order to alleviate this large excursions in the pleural pressure, why don't we add some pressure to the airway, to the airways here? And look at the right side. By adding, let's just say, the same amount of auto-PEEP that we have. So we have alveolar pressure of 10 centimeters. Let's just add another 10 centimeters here. So what we're doing here, we're equalizing the pressure between the airways and the alveoli. Okay. Now it is very clear. In order to have a gradient, now all what we need is we need to drop the pressure from 10 to 7. Much better than the previous one. The previous one, you need to drop it to -3. And we're able to do this by going down from the pleural pressure of +3 to -3. So you can drop the pressure here by 3 centimeters of water, and then you create a gradient. If the ventilator is said to be triggered at this difference, which is -3, or a drop in the pressure of 3 centimeters of water, then the ventilator will be triggered. This way, what did we do? We were able to help the patient generating less pressure to trigger the ventilator, or generating less pressure to inhale. So if he's on spontaneous breathing, he doesn't have to drop the pressure to -13 in order to get that gradient of 3 centimeters of water. All what he needs to do is drop the pressure to 7 centimeters of water in order to generate the gradient and then inspiratory flow. This is a little bit complicated, but let's just see if we can actually walk through it. And first, let me explain to you. The solid red line is the airway pressure. The dotted line is the alveolar pressure. Then you have the flow in light blue, and you have the esophageal pressure in orange color. So let's try to analyze this graph wave by wave. Well, it looks like this is the alveolar pressure, right? And the alveolar pressure is at 15 centimeters of water. So you can see here alveolar pressure 15 centimeters of water, and the airway pressure, which is the red line, the red solid line, it is at 0. So the machine measures the airway pressure. It does not measure the alveolar pressure. And as you know, in order to measure this pressure, you need to put expiratory hold. And by putting expiratory hold, you're equalizing the pressure in the alveoli and the airways. So what you see is that airway pressure would go up to 15. Anyhow, what you see right now is auto-PEEP of 15 centimeters of water. You can see it here. Airway pressure 0, that's a solid line, and alveolar pressure of 15 centimeters of water. Well, at the same time, the patient started to drop his esophageal pressure. He dropped the pressure to -7, meaning that it went down by 7 centimeters of water. You can see it here. That means now we drop, if this goes to -7, 15 -7 is 8 centimeters of water. That means that we have now 8 centimeters of water here. You can see the airway, the alveolar pressure here. It needs to go down a little bit. But that was ineffective to trigger the ventilator. Why? You need to have a drop of 2 centimeters below the airway pressure. The airway pressure is 0. You need to get that lower by 2 centimeters in order to effectively trigger the ventilator. The patient should have done -17. So he could not effectively trigger the ventilator. You can see the next one here. The patient also initiated breath. And you can see the ventilator delivered breath. However, he did not reach the threshold. He dropped the pressure better than the first one. You can see here, orange color, this is esophageal. He dropped it to -8 centimeters of water. That means it was better than this one. He dropped the alveolar pressure to 7. 15 -8 is 7 centimeters. However, this is not generating any pressure below 0, and patient did not trigger the ventilator. However, there is a breath, and this is mandatory breath. It happened at the same time where the patient is trying to take a breath, but the trigger for the ventilator is the time. Now let's go to the right side and see exactly what we did. We said, let's just give this patient some PEEP. So here we added PEEP. And when you add PEEP, you add PEEP to the airways. Of course, we don't know how much would be transmitted into the alveoli because there's auto-PEEP already of 15. Most likely you're not going to be able to get anything. You're adding pressure to the airways here. And you see now the solid red line increased up to 10. This is the external PEEP that we added. The alveolar pressure still at the same level, which is 15. This is the auto-PEEP. Now, for this patient to trigger, all what we need is a drop in the pressure by 2 centimeters of water. Meaning if we drop the airway pressure from 10 to 8, we'll be able to trigger the ventilator. While this patient in this breath here, you can see he dropped the esophageal pressure by 6 centimeters of water. That's 15 minus 6, 11. So he did not, 15 minus 6 is 9. So he dropped the pressure only by 1 centimeter of water. It was not enough to trigger the ventilator. And you see, this is wasted effort. The patient could not trigger the ventilator. Now, if we set the airway pressure or the PEEP at 12 centimeters of water, it would have been able to trigger the ventilator. In the next breath here, you can see that the patient's inspiratory effort was better. He dropped the esophageal pressure by 7 centimeters of water. So this is a drop in the pressure. And by this drop in the pressure, that caused the alveolar pressure to drop from 15 minus 7, 8 centimeters of water. What does it mean? If we have 8 centimeters of water here, that means there is a gradient between the airway pressure of 10 and the alveolar pressure of 8. That is a minus 2 centimeters of water that we need to trigger the ventilator. And you can see the ventilator was triggered. And this is the airway pressure for the ventilator. Okay. This is the last example here. You can see the same thing when we have PEEP of 0 in a patient with dynamic hyperinflation. This patient is a COPDer. When we add PEEP, and you can see the airway pressure, how it's increased by adding the PEEP of 10 centimeters of water. This is the esophageal excrusions. You can see how big they were before. In order to trigger the ventilator, the patient was able to trigger the ventilator every time, but look at his inspiratory efforts. He needed to decrease the esophageal pressure or the interthoracic pressure large enough to overcome the auto-PEEP. But once we add the PEEP of 10, look how we relieve the patient from having to decrease that pressure that much. And now he can easily able to trigger the ventilator. The patient did not have to drop the pressure that much in order to trigger the ventilator. Why? Because we equalized the pressure in the airways and the pressure in the alveoli by adding some PEEP. Of course, we don't know if you want to eliminate any gradient between the airway, any positive gradient between the airway and the alveoli, you need to set the PEEP at the same level of the auto-PEEP. So you put expiratory hold, you measure the auto-PEEP. Let's just say that you have auto-PEEP of 10, then add PEEP of 10, equalize the pressure. If you add less than 10, that means the patient has to work for the difference. That pressure needs to be dropped below the airway pressure in order to trigger the ventilator, and you can set the trigger level accordingly. With this, I would stop here and see if you have any questions. You can put the question in the chat section, or you can raise your hand and mute yourself and ask the question. Okay, Dr. Ala, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mazen. It was an informative lecture as usual. But I have one question. I'm confused about regarding transpulmonary pressures. So what I understand, we need in case of the inspiration, we need the airway pressure from high to low to deliver the breath. But in case of the auto-PEEP in inspiration, we need add auto-PEEP in the transpulmonary pressures to to overcome the airway pressures. So the transpulmonary pressure in inspiration usually is negative and expiration is positive, or I was mistaken.
So say the last part again is transpulmonary pressure.
We need something beep to estimate the airway pressures. So in inspiration, we need transpulmonary pressure in negative, and in expiration, transpulmonary pressure in positive.
Okay, so let's again look at this. Now, when you are introducing the transpulmonary pressure is the airway pressure minus the esophageal pressure or the intrathoracic pressure. This is the distending pressure on the alveoli. Of course, when I say airway pressure, I don't mean the peak pressure, okay? I mean the plateau pressure. Because this is the pressure that is required to extend the alveoli in inspiration. In expiration, the airway pressure is the PEEP. Okay, so transpulmonary pressure in expiration is whatever PEEP, here we have a PEEP of 0, minus the intrathoracic pressure. Well, when you have auto-PEEP, you're not seeing this. You're measuring airway pressure here of 0. This is expiration. And you're not seeing the auto-PEEP. If you were able to see the auto-PEEP, then that pressure will be higher. So on the alveoli here, take a look here. On the alveoli, the transpulmonary pressure at the level of the alveoli is the auto-PEEP minus the intrathoracic pressure. Now this is expiration. Now you go to inspiration. In inspiration, the machine delivers the breath. And when it delivers the breath, I'm not talking about spontaneous breath now, I'm talking about active ventilator breath. The plateau pressure will extend the alveoli. And the plateau pressure minus the intrathoracic pressure will be transpulmonary pressure. So if you add PEEP to the system, okay, that plateau pressure will go above that PEEP, and the PEEP will actually overcome the airway pressure here. It will overcome the auto-PEEP that the patient is generating because of the dynamic hyperinflation. Now, adding the PEEP to the system, meaning that the plateau pressure is going to be higher now, because you're going to increase the plateau pressure higher than the PEEP in order to deliver the inspiration. I may not have understood your question very well, but I just wanted to explain it to you. Is it now clearer? Is it more clear?
Yes.
Okay. So you need to think about transpulmonary pressure as an extending pressure. Of course, if you're not measuring the alveolar pressure, we're just taking in inspiration, the plateau pressure, in expiration, the PEEP pressure. Transpulmonary pressure will be, however, in reality, at the level of the alveoli, transpulmonary pressure is the auto-PEEP minus intrathoracic pressure. And in inspiration, it is the plateau pressure minus the intrathoracic pressure. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. In modern ventilators, the difference between flow and pressure triggering is just a technical one. Or does it make sense to switch to flow triggering in case of auto-PEEP? All right. So now most of the modern ventilators are only set for flow trigger. And the reason being, well, theoretically, you would think that, well, how come I'm setting the ventilator for the flow where there's no flow without decreasing the pressure? So what happens first? Is it the flow or the decrease in the pressure? No, it's the decrease in the pressure. You decrease the pressure first. Take a look on this here. First, you decrease the pressure. Then you create a gradient. As a result of the gradient, you have the flow. And why the modern ventilators are set for the flow, not the pressure? Because you can sense the flow at a faster rate. The microprocessor that we have can sense the flow much faster than sensing the drop in the pressure. So you can respond to the flow in a faster way than to the pressure. So that's number one, to just explain the pressure versus flow. If you have a ventilator that has both options, I would recommend to use the flow option. Always set it to be triggered by the flow. Now, does it make sense to switch to flow triggering in case of auto-PEEP? It does not. You need to generate the flow. And in order to generate the flow, you need to drop the pressure below the auto-PEEP. So no matter what you do, the flow, once it is generated, that means you overcome the auto-PEEP. So if the auto-PEEP is 10 centimeter, before generating any flow, it has to go down to -1, -2. So you can generate a flow at -1, -2, and then how much is that flow? You determine the trigger level for the flow, and then the response will be faster. So again, this is very good question actually. The patient has to overcome that auto-PEEP first before generating any flow. So you're not triggering at all unless you go below that auto-PEEP of 10 in this example. And then after that, well, if you're setting it to be triggered based on the pressure, you need to drop the airway pressure. So everything happens after we drop the pressure below the auto-PEEP. So that's why I say it doesn't make any difference. At that time, while you're setting it to be triggered by the pressure, you need to drop that pressure. If you're setting it for the flow, you need to generate that flow. And as I said, whether you have auto-PEEP or not, responding to the flow is much faster than responding to the pressure drop. Let's see if we have any other questions. Intrapulmonary pressure decrease in inspiration. Screen is black. I'm sorry. Okay, any other questions? You can raise your hand or just unmute yourself and ask the question. Paolo, did I answer your question? And Dala, you have your hand still raised if you have another question. Okay, thank you, Paolo. Okay, if no more questions, I would like to thank you for attending this. And next week we'll talk about another concept. I'm thinking of either automatic tube compensation or we can talk about P 0.1, pressure at 0.1 second. If no other comments, if you have any suggestions, please send it in the chat section or send an email to me, and I would be more than happy to explain that. If not, I would like to thank you for attending this session and hope to see you next week. Thank you.